Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Osama Abi Murshid, Director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2013 Annual Symposium, The Mediterranean Reimagined. I want to begin by thanking Professor Edmund Burke for giving our symposium a right proper start with his engaging and thought-provoking keynote address last night. I'm sure his observations will continue to resonate throughout today's proceedings. And I also extend to you the greetings of Professor Carol Lancaster, Dean of the School of Foreign Service. She regrets that she's not able to be with us this morning, but she will join us for the afternoon panel to say a few words about our late colleague, Faruk Tabak, to whose memory we dedicate this symposium. Faruk Tabak began teaching at Georgetown University's McGee Center for Mediterranean Studies in 1995, before joining the School of Foreign Service core faculty as Ertegun Professor of Modern Turkish Studies in 2000. His main work, The Waning of the Mediterranean, was published in 2008, shortly before his most untimely death. This event, therefore, is a long overdue celebration of this remarkable and essential book, and I would like now actually, what I'm going to do is I'll later ask, in the afternoon, we're going to also ask my colleague and a dear friend of Professor Tabak, Timothy Beach, to also say a few words about Faruk. And I'm certain that Faruk would be very pleased with our lineup of distinguished speakers, and speaking of which, I want to offer all my appreciation to my colleagues on the Symposium Committee, Professors Judith Tucker and Joseph Sassoon, for coming together in conceptualizing the symposium and populating its panels. My thanks also to Professors Elliott, Colla, Fida Adeli, and Joseph Sassoon for chairing their respective panels. And it goes without saying that our ship would not have sailed without the tireless efforts and support of the terrific staff of the CCAS, and I will acknowledge them collectively for now, and hope to thank them more personally at the conclusion of today's panels. So thank you all for attending and for being with us today. And now, without further delay, I will cede the podium to my colleague, Professor Elliott Colla. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome you all to the first panel today. Rather than introduce everyone individually, I would like to direct your attention to the program where you'll find more information about our four very distinguished speakers. We have a very strong panel, and I have been charged with keeping the time accurate and strict, and then we've already gotten off schedule. So when I step in, please note that my role it's a role, it's a social role. It's not my character to do this normally. Each speaker, and they will speak in the order that they are presented in the schedule. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and we will have a short period, 10 minutes, for discussion and questions afterwards. If I could ask, since we would like to give equal time to all four speakers today, if I could ask when you have questions or comments to please keep them as direct as possible. Okay, so our first speaker is Professor John McNeill.
Right. Thank you very much, Elliott, and thank you to all those who are responsible for letting me take part in the CCAS annual symposium. It is an honor, especially as I am not an Arab studies person. I am a fish out of water here, but because the symposium is dedicated to the memory of Faruk Tabak, it's something that I dearly wanted to be a part of. I'm going to speak about that particular book, The Waning of the Mediterranean, that Osama mentioned, and this is the general plan of what I expect to do. My plans usually go awry, so it remains to be seen whether or not I'll actually do this, but this is the plan. That bridge in Epirus, northwestern Greece, was built to withstand big, strong floods. It's from the early 18th century. The significance of that, I hope, will become apparent in the course of this talk. So I'll begin with a few words about Faruk, whom I knew in his Georgetown years. He was originally an architecture student, and I bring this up because he had a interest in and gave attention to matters of form and proportion, and I kind of think that this might have been a reflection of his early training in architecture. Be that as it may, he left architecture behind and followed a small rivulet of Turks to Binghamton, New York, where he studied with Emanuel Wallerstein and became a historical sociologist in the world systems tradition. Ultimately, he wrote a dissertation about agriculture in Anatolia in those years, which you can read. But as a student there, and especially as a research associate at the so-called Fernand Braudel Center in Binghamton, he developed an outlook which took him well beyond his dissertation area and became something of a global historian and sociologist with interests that reached back approximately 1,000 years. This is unusual for sociologists, unusual for historical sociologists, unusual for world systems theorists. Faruk reminded me a little bit of the aphorism attributed to the playwright Terence, which is usually translated as, I am human, I consider that nothing to do with humans is alien to me. I knew Faruk in an intellectual friendship, and I want to say a word or two about what that was like. I always felt it was, to use the language of world systems theory, an unequal exchange. I was getting more out of it than Faruk was, and therefore that the terms of trade were favorable from my point of view. Sometimes I felt it was like drinking from a fire hose. Faruk would splash me with citations and references and things that I ought to read and things that I ought to know. But in the end, he was always patient with people like me who never were fully convinced by the gospel of world systems theory. Faruk would tell me all the time that I wasn't understanding the world properly, but he would still happily converse at great length and try to bring me around. Now, many people, some of whom are in this room, knew Faruk in other contexts as well, as a cinephile, enophile, gourmand, gourmet. I did not. I was only aware of his deep and abiding fascination with the French actress Catherine Deneuve, which I'm sure was not unique to Faruk. So, the Binghamton context. Wallerstein, his students, his associates, understood the world in a particular way, a way that I regard as economistic, that is unduly focused on economic and especially commercial relationships, and negligent of cultural, religious, and ecological relationships. Wallerstein himself had a tiny interest in things environmental in his magnum opus, which is now at 4 volumes, The World System, Modern World System. He referred at times to soil exhaustion. That is about the only nod in the direction of things ecological in Wallerstein's work, which is not to say he wasn't open to it. He was not dogmatic about it as irrelevant. He just didn't do it himself. He had, Wallerstein, what I regard as a partial embrace of the outlook of the French historian Fernand Braudel. The part he liked was Braudel's arguments about a so-called world economy, a system unto itself that was not necessarily global. Indeed, there was a Mediterranean world economy in Braudel's mind. But Braudel's fascination with the details of landscape and geography, arising out of the tradition of French possibilist geography, Wallerstein did not share. Faruk, Tabak, on the other hand, did embrace both the world economy notion of Braudel and the fascination with landscape, geography, and environment. And he took Braudel one step further because Faruk, recognized the salience of environmental change, which Braudel, with very scant exception, did not. In fact, Faruk, in this book, put environmental change close to the center of his analysis. And that made Faruk unique in the orbit of Wallerstein at Binghamton and made him unique within the larger tribe of world systems theorists at that time. Since then, one or two others have gone in similar directions. Now, I had intended to say lots about the book in and of itself, but I'm already well into my allotted time, so I will truncate this. You can read it faster than I can speak it in any event. So just a few words. It is a work, first and foremost, of historical sociology, which means that it seeks to find system and pattern as its primary goal. As a world systems book, it is concerned with delineating a so-called world economy, and I should have put a hyphen in there. The world systems theory people are very particular about that hyphen. And it makes the case that the Mediterranean world economy can only be understood with reference to far-flung places. The grain fields of the Baltic, the gold fields of Bambouk in West Africa, the West Indian sugarcane fields, and silver mines of Potosi, the fiscal policy of Ming China. All these things are relevant to the Mediterranean in Tabak's analysis. Through the intervention of our Georgetown colleague Jim Collins, I was, strange as it seems, dining with Emmanuel Le in the spring of 2009. He didn't know who I was. That's not so strange. But he asked me, when he heard I was from Georgetown, if I was aware of what he called this superlative new book by someone he had never heard of, Faruk Tabak. And I was aware of the book. That was just 12 months after the book was published, after Faruk died. So I'll go no further in my general assessment of the book and say something about it as environmental history, because that is the tribe that I belong to, environmental history. So there are 4 points to make here. One is Faruk's stress on the importance of newly introduced crops to the Mediterranean region. Here he was drawing first on the work of Andrew Watson and secondly on the work of Alfred Crosby. There's nothing controversial that Faruk does with this subject except that he emphasizes the significance of the plantation crops that arrive from the Indian Ocean world, sugar and cotton foremost among them. And then from the 16th century forward, the American food crops, maize, potatoes foremost among them. And the significance of these is that maize and potatoes can be cultivated at high elevations as well as lower ones quite successfully, and that they provided an avenue of escape for Mediterranean peasant populations when the lowlands, in Faruk's analysis, became less and less rewarding and indeed less and less habitable for reasons that I'll explain in just a moment. So that's a maize harvest on the right in a village in southeastern Spain in a valley called the Alpujarra. Part of the environmental approach that Tabak took was to emphasize climate change, unique among world systems theorists at that time. To do this, Tabak had to embrace data from the natural sciences, which he did, I would say, partially. He read some of the dendrochronological studies. He didn't look at some of the other kinds of natural science proxy evidence for climate change. But he fully took on board the notion of what the climate historians call the medieval climate optimum and then the Little Ice Age. And you can see the graph here of average temperatures in the northern hemisphere. All the different colors represent different climate reconstructions, but there's broad agreement among them. So for Tabak, this was really important, not because it got a little bit colder in the Mediterranean, because it got stormier and rainier. And the stormier part is the most important, as you'll see in just a moment, because according to Tabak, and he's not alone in this, the climate historians agree, there are a whole lot more big floods. And that, as I'll say in a moment, contributed to making the lowlands less rewarding and less habitable. There's another Ottoman bridge in the upper right, also from northwestern Greece, outside the village of Kalaritis, and a modern flood in southern Spain. Just to remind you that those allegedly dry landscapes of the Mediterranean can sometimes be severely flooded. The third issue that is important in Tabak's ecological analysis is deforestation and erosion. He tends to bring these together in his analysis, which a lot of scholars of environmental change in the Mediterranean have done, including myself. This is an area of Mediterranean environmental studies that has a lot of controversy in it. To what extent is the manifest soil erosion human-caused? To what extent is it a natural phenomenon? And people argue about this at great lengths and sometimes with personal invective thrown in, which is quite unlike Tabak. He did not engage in that. On the lower right, and Professor Beach, if he's, yes, he is here, his heart is palpitating to see this scene of rill and gully erosion in the Rif Mountains of northern Morocco. And on the bottom left, a map of a valley in southern Spain, the Adra River Valley, that has filled in through sedimentation in the last 500 years. So these are illustrations of the erosion phenomenon that was central to Tabak's ecological analysis. So very quickly, Faruk claimed that there was a surge of deforestation throughout the region associated with an economic boom overseen by Venetian and Genoese commercial power, and that when followed by more rainfall, more storminess, more floods, led to a prolonged surge of erosion and then along coastal plains sedimentation and wetlands formation. And hence, in Tabak's analysis, more malaria. So the Little Ice Age was significant in the Mediterranean, according to Tabak, for its storminess, not for temperature, and he did not make much out of drought. And paradoxical as it may seem, higher flood frequency and higher drought frequency can be simultaneous in any given region. So the last point is the significance of all this for the malaria regime in the Mediterranean. When Tabak argues that the Mediterranean waned, it was its commercial vitality underpinned by cash crops that suffered most conspicuously. Populations retreated to the mountains, undertaking both herding and self-sufficient agriculture with maize, potatoes, etc., garden crops. And the trigger for this change, above all else, was the increasing severity and frequency of malaria in the lowlands, especially in the rich bottomlands, the alluvial plains of the rivers that had been the seat of commercial agriculture par excellence in the region. So that he saw as beginning to take shape in the late 16th century and lasting until the late 19th century. And he calls that a long agrarian cycle. At the end of the 19th century, malaria begins to retreat, he claims, swamp drainage, and eventually interventions in the form of mosquito control. I think he's a little bit early, especially with the swamp drainage, more 20th century phenomenon in the late 19th. And he's a little bit mechanical in his connection between the erosion, sedimentation, expansion of wetlands, and an intensified malaria regime. Because you got to pay attention to some intervening variables, the nature of the mosquitoes and their habits, their breeding preferences, their feeding preferences. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the primary vector of malaria is this creature here, Anopheles sakharovi, which, if it has its choice, will bite donkeys rather than people. It will bite people if donkeys are not available, donkeys and other large quadrupeds, but it's not an extremely efficient vector of malaria. And so a closer study, more data of various sorts, would have made that connection between landscape change and malaria regime a bit more convincing than Tabak was able to make it. I'm bringing this to a close. This painting is of, as you can see, rice transplanting. It's by an Italian artist, Angelo Marbelli, from 1901. So Tabak's book, in its ecological dimensions, provides a powerful challenge to world systems theory in general, because world systems theory is, by and large, unecological. And Tabak put ecological change at the center of his analysis. It's also a challenge to the provincialism of Mediterranean history, both in its subunits, national histories and local histories, but even in its entirety, because Tabak argues that the common fortunes, as he often puts it, of the Mediterranean region were shaped by far-flung phenomena and trends in the Americas, in China, in Africa, in Northern Europe. He's wrong on a few small details in his environmental historical analysis, or at least I think so. He's a little bit overconfident in some of the generalizations that he offers, especially about the connections between landscape change and malaria. But I would say, in toto, that Le Roi Latterie was not far wrong when he described it as a superlative new book. So, in the aphorismi of the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, you can find this phrase, O vios vrachis ide techni macri, perhaps better known to you in its Latin form, vita brevis ars longa, short life, but a work or an art that will be long-lasting. That's how I think of Faruk. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions, discussion. Yeah, Molly.
I'd be curious to know how Faruk Tabak fit this analysis with the refugees. Sort of overwhelming consensus among Ottoman historians that it's after the 16th century that we see the massive, well, we see extensive commercialization of the Ottoman economy.
Extensive commercialization of the Ottoman economy, maybe so, and I have to say that this is an arena that others in the room are probably far better informed upon than I am. Faruk's argument is less about the Ottoman economy as a whole than about agriculture. And he maintains that within the Ottoman lands, as elsewhere in the northern Mediterranean, doesn't have much to say about North Africa or Egypt, and indeed Egypt doesn't really fit because there are no mountains. That commercial agriculture after 1550, 1560 is sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly diminishing. And if the Ottoman historians are unhappy with that, then they have an argument with Faruk, and Faruk has an argument with them. I mean, he came out of Ottoman agrarian studies. That's the piece that he knew best. The part of the book that has an archival basis, which is not an extensive archival basis, deals with Anatolian agriculture. So if he's at odds with Ottoman historians, that may, I'm not sure whom to believe. I wouldn't bet against him. But Gabor Augustin might have a better answer than I to this. If so, he's not saying.
How would this fit what you just said about Tabak's vision of the Mediterranean? How would population decline fit into this picture in the 17th century, which has been explained by environmental, with the Little Ice Age? But I like the malaria, although you are not convinced, because that would strengthen this argument. That is, after the surge of population in the 16th century, there is a decline in the 17th century.
Yeah, at least in most parts. Somewhat uneven in its timing, but as a general phenomenon, I think what you say is correct. Tabak, interestingly, is not much interested in population figures. If you look at the book, there's very little in the way of population data in there. In fact, there's very little in the way of numbers in there, which is part of the world systems theory culture. Wallerstein has been relentlessly criticized for making statements about the direction and trajectory of economic history without quantitative data. The same charge could be leveled against Faruk. Despite being a sociologist, he wrote with ambitions to literary art. And I know, for example, Tim Beach and his wife used to read sections of this book to one another for its lyrical quality, which I have to say I think is an indication that they read too much geomorphology and geochemistry. next to which, at any rate, the general vision that Tabak offers is easily compatible with the notion of broad 17th century population decline throughout the region, even if you don't emphasize malaria. My argument, this is parenthetical, is that we don't really know about the intensification of the malaria regime. It's a plausible argument, but we don't have adequate data to support it. It could have been, but it might also not have been. There could be other reasons behind population decline. And in Tabak's book, there could be other reasons behind population decline. Notably, the widespread, although not universal, abandonment of the most fertile lands of the region, and an overall reduction in food production, particularly a couple of staples, rice, lowland wheat. So I don't see any tension there.
If there's no other questions at the moment, we can turn to our next speaker, Professor Julia Clancy-Smith, and that way we'll have extra time at the end today. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for being here, and I'm myself am delighted to be back home in Georgetown once again. Thanks to Osama and the center and other institutions and individuals. So the title of my talk is How Mediterraneans Came to Be. And my first observation is that if we look at the time period from Carthage, that is 800 BC, to colonialism, historical narratives of the Mediterranean in certain areas suffer from a missing persons, places, and syndrome, and that, of course, is to varying degrees. The sea's northern edge has been privileged in historical studies over the Levant, and studies of the Eastern Mediterranean have somehow taken, assumed more prominence than those having to do with the West, that is the Maghreb, where in traditional narratives, North Africa was peopled mainly by sort of shady corsairs, pirates and Berbers, and after 1830 was mainly peopled by the colonized. So what my paper does is to ask the following. What if perspectives were skewed if the mappable center or multiple centers came to rest somewhere on the North African coast in the time just before colonialism, and then the story or stories were carried both forward in time and backwards? Things might slide momentarily out of order or out of focus and out of order, which is the point. So my paper, the first thing my paper does is to retrace the journeys and detours that ultimately produce my book entitled Mediterraneans, and the questions that rose along the way, including those questions that are still pending. Some time ago, the anthropologist James Clifford posed a query that went something like this: who is localized when the ethnographer's tent is pitched in the center of the village, end of quote. So I see what I'm doing here as a sort of a riff off of Clifford. My question is, who and what is localized when the historian decamps, turning her gaze to a different village and maybe not even to the center of the village? At the end of my paper, I reflect and speculate on how Faruk Tabak's evocative work might nudge us toward a more environmentally grounded history of the Maghreb before colonialism. And of course, such a history would build on John McNeill's study, as well as stories of mountains in 5 places. So first of all, my own research. A major question that drove that research was a simple one. Why leave home? Home being mainly the Catholic islands and Catholic islands near to North Africa and Southern Europe. Why leave home if North Africa, until the 1820s, was seen as a land of danger, of captivity, and apostasy, and its inhabitants as, quote, corsairs and pitiless enemies of the Christians, end of quote. In other words, how was North Africa transformed in the Western or European collective imagination and practice into one of the most active migratory frontiers in the Mediterranean. And this occurred in less than 2 decades. And what historical forces converged to convince Italian, Spanish, Maltese, or Sicilian peasants that this place of idolatrous oppression offered opportunities for good fortune, for making it? But it took me a long time to formulate questions such as this. I had to consider not only changing forms of empire, but also new kinds of visual imperialism, as well as technologies of movement, evolving forms of protection, etc., to even begin there. And I don't mean to suggest that it was only the folks from the European, in quotes, islands or the northern rim of the Mediterranean that left home, far from that. The problem then became how to narrate the history of the modern Mediterranean world from simultaneous vantage points. From the vantage point of those people claiming to be of the Maghreb, and in the Maghreb at the same time, and those folks who, by travel or by accident, became in the Maghreb, and who were seen by North Africans as they had a sort of a wide array of taxonomies, but some of these folks showing up in North Africa after 1820 were seen as unprocessed foreigners, familiar strangers, not quite indigenous, not quite European, or as Creoles secreted by elective cultural naturalization. So one solution to this attempt to sort of simultaneously look at how these people looked at each other simultaneously, one solution was to engage in what I would call travel and co-residence at the same time. Another solution was close scrutiny of Europe's exiled, of its expulsés, and the people shoveled out of Europe, wherever that is, as well as the notorious high rollers of expanding imperialism. So these strategies, or these solutions, integrated the northern rims of the Mediterranean into a Maghreb-centered narrative, at least momentarily. All right, so what did we learn from this process of inversion or of pitching our tents elsewhere? And what peoples and places remain archived in the gone missing file? First of all, the first conclusion that I reached was that even without 1830, that is French Algeria, north to south migrations would have transpired anyway due to population overshoot, and I first learned that from John, on the big islands, big and small islands framing the Maghreb, notably along the Malta-Tunis axis or corridor. Trans-island and other kinds of movements to the North African littoral from the early 19th century, above all Algeria, primed the migratory pump, I would argue, for larger, wider migratory pulses across the Mediterranean and then a little bit later on across the Atlantic. The number of people who settled in Algiers or Tunis, then returned to Sicily, for example, only to set out for the Americas or Australia is significant. In addition, sojourners who had settled, they thought permanently in North Africa, and then took off for other places, left their mark there. Conversely, these sojourners were deeply influenced by that experience, by living in North Africa. And when they did leave, when they did decamp, in effect they took the Maghreb with them, whatever their ultimate destination. Of course, there was nothing innocent about any of this. Second thing, people, including North Africans, left home for many reasons, often in spite of themselves. Leaving constituted an ever-present adjacent possible, and migrants were and are always much more than that. Directly related, the notion that there existed a fatal divergence in the ways that Muslim and Western societies or peoples came to modernity is no longer credible, and there I'm poaching on Edmund Burke's work. Viewed from below, wherever that below fell, one sees that the transformations of the long 19th century did not necessarily advantage specific national, in quotes, or specific national, social, or religious groups, at least at certain junctures. Many sought to reap some benefit from new, novel, and perhaps disquieting trends, while cutting potential losses. and religious affiliation, while a critical source and fund of communal and legal identity, was not always the most operational. What for the historians constitute the major markers and ruptures of the 19th century, imperialism, invasion, migrations, and disadvantageous diplomatic agreements, those seem to matter less in some places and times for some people. Frequently, the heterogeneous parties to transnational deals or disputes were oblivious or unconcerned about treaties, for example, or had long ago worked out successful dodging evasions. To give an example, for the Algerian merchant Jacob Lasry, 1830 represented not disaster, that is the invasion of Algeria, not disaster, but a spectacular windfall. He made a fortune and mounds of debt by trafficking with the French army, drawing upon much older trans-Mediterranean circuits, notably the Gibraltar-Tetuan-Oran triangle. Another point, and here I'm sort of going from what I learned from this exercise in the book Mediterraneans to what's in the still gone missing file or dossier. Ports functioned as the interface between North African producers and trans-sea distribution networks, presenting the state with the first or last chance to tax, limit, or prescribe seaborne commerce and population movements. Yet sailors, captains, and fishermen are almost completely absent from North African sources, and in consequence in current historical narratives, which I find somewhat curious in light of the region's long, intense involvement in the sea. One might ask why, and of course there are lots of reasons I could give for this, but let me just run one by you. For the sailing specialists or the men of the sea or the seafarers, as we might call them, the Mediterranean represented not a place of transit, but a place of residence. This often rendered, in the eyes of local elites, and not just in North Africa, rendered the men of the sea morally suspect, in the same way that islanders were regarded as, with some unease and indeed suspicion, by land-based states, maritime republics, and elites. The notion of a hyper-connected Mediterranean will be my next point. I think that one could argue that the Mediterranean was a hyper-connected place on the eve of the First Roman Punic War, we're back in 263 BCE. But I won't unpack that right now. Of course, a sense of understanding an awareness of the panoptic Mediterranean. Most people did not have that until very recently, and instead viewed the sea as a space of multiple and imminent dangers as well as possibility. The modern world is incomprehensible, it seems to me, without a social history that takes into account the existence of oppositional cultures on ships or in ports among laborers whose toil underwrote the global maritime economy. I see ships as constituting their own sort of social, religious, and legal universe, as sort of floating republics. Republics that change constantly with warfare or peace, bad or good sailing weather, boom or bust commercial conditions, and as their crews, the identity of their slaves, the rowers, the merchandise, and other things changed rapidly. And to give you one typical example, in the 19th century, a sailor, a North African sailor, a guy by the name of Ahmed bin Zerti, ran a coastal pilgrimage travel center between eastern Algeria, Tunisian ports, and Alexandria. He picked up, and this is a sort of a classical form of cabotage, picking up and dropping off folks and goods here and there, and also engaging at the same time in a flourishing contraband or smuggling business, although I'm not sure he would call it that, or maybe he didn't care. In any case, he followed, that is our friend Ali bin Zerti, more or less the same sailing routes, contingent on season, winds, and weather, which might suggest that in his vision, and back to my point about the panoptic Mediterranean, when did people have this sort of view of the sea? But in his vision, the sea probably did not constitute a space of webbed connectivities, the way we think of it now, as much as patterned opportunity or risk aversion. Nevertheless, the changing contents and identity of the passengers aboard bin Zerti's ship signaled its movement and position along a local global fault line. Other kinds of ships in this period were little more than floating prisons, vessels loaded with people who were either had been forced into exile, who had been forcibly expatriated from some point or another around the Mediterranean, but who were not allowed to land in port because they lacked landing papers. So these new forms of sort of floating prisons, I suppose one could say that this is true earlier during the slavery and coarser centuries, but in any case, these floating prisons were largely the product of the fact that changing notions and practices of legal protection and identity had generated new forms of unbelonging, inauthenticity, and rootlessness. And this brings me to my next point about movement and dissimulation. Movement across the sea in many places and periods often demanded creative dissimulation, which of course renders the historian's task even more difficult. People were not who or what they purported to be, and neither were the ships often. Uncertainty was leveraged for preservation and advancement. From the traveling 16th and 17th century English Protestants who not only dressed as Catholics, they ate as Catholics. I don't know what that means. Oh, of course, fish on Friday, how could I forget? And they attended Mass as they entered ports under Spanish, French, or Italian authority. We also find a number of women dressed as men disembarking in North African ports, and I could furnish a lot of other examples. My point is that movement and the risks it entailed once again imposed dissimulation. Many, if most of the folks who landed by design or serendipity in 19th century North Africa could furnish an array of identities depending on the urgency of circumstances. For example, in 1870, Nicolas, allegedly a soldier in the Pope's army, arrived in Tunis, got into a barroom brawl in the port at La Goulette, and claimed 5 different legal jurisdictional identities before being hustled aboard a French military vessel bound for Bonn. And if any of you read my book, it's overly, there's an embarras of richesse of these little stories in that book. But as we know, pattern dissimulation was by no means characteristic of the 19th century. For example, okay, good. The Spanish Jew Girolamo converted to Catholicism, fended off the Inquisitors' charges of apostasy in the 17th century by claiming that he had only assumed the name Jacob Gomez of Tetuan and the guise of a Jew in order to, quote, travel to Algiers to baptize all those Turks who have not yet reached the age of reason, end of quote. Unfortunately, for them at least, 2 English Quaker ladies, Catherine Evans and Sarah Cheeves, refused, or at least failed, to conceal their identity when they disembarked in the same century at Valletta, where they were brought before the Inquisitor on suspicion that they intended to proselytize, either among the Catholics or perhaps the Moors of North Africa. Only the gendered notion that their religious beliefs and public preaching, or attempts to, in Malta, signaled a special kind of womanly madness, spared them from long imprisonment. Although gender norms and the unfortunate state of being born female limited or prescribed much in terms of physical mobility, it might offer protection of a sort. Indeed, protection, the notion of protection, the status of protege, had various connotations across the Mediterranean world in different periods. Individuals seeking protection and those conferring or extending it frequently had contradictory mental maps and socio-legal expectations. Protection calls forth the state of the unequal. Thus, one strategy for historicizing the Mediterranean North Africa, or for looking at it from the viewpoint of a different kind of village, one strategy for doing this is to, I suggest, is to exhume localized social and cultural practices of protection, legal, political, and otherwise, and try and link them to pattern forms of dissimulation. So I'm proposing to triangulate between movement, dissimulation, and protection. Well, hélas, I'll have to skip over this part and go on to my last remarks, which have to do with Faruk's work, Geographies of Exchange and Contestation. Here I propose that we consider not only prime-time port cities such as Izmir, Alexandria, and Constantinople, but rather understudied, more modest sites like Tetuan or Portofarina, which in fact might yield richer insights. I can't go into what's going on in Tetuan, we'll talk about it later, but more to the point, can we interweave the narrative of rise and fall in terms of the fortunes of various port cities and connect it to shifting environmental structures? So this is something that is new, and I'm just going to try it out on you, and it might not succeed or it might not fail. In any case, to take Portofarino as an example, as a site of trying to connect much larger tectonic shifts in environmental structures with the fortunes of a particular Mediterranean port city. Today, Portofarina is a sleepy town several kilometers from the sea, as it has been for about the past 2 centuries. But it wasn't always that way. Until the late 18th century, Portofarina was a courser capital of the southern Mediterranean, almost rivaling Tunis and perhaps eclipsing some other ports. Now, Faruk really didn't pay too much attention to pirates and coursers, and that's certainly not a flaw, although luckily, mercifully, Molly Green has done so for a while, and Judith Tucker as well. However, Tabak did employ piracy to index the relative strength or weakness of the state, and also to make the point that maritime raiding led to, during the coarser centuries of the 16th to 18th centuries, but maritime raiding led to declines in coastal villages as populations sought security inland and upland, as John just mentioned a moment ago. So what I'm going to try and do in the last minute that I have here is to make some sort of connections between those 2 things, declining port fortunes and changes in environmental structures. I think it's important that the coarser centuries, 16th to 18th, also coincide with the Little Ice Age. And I'm not at all, I mean, this is John's bailiwick and some other people here, so I really don't know what I'm talking about. But it seemed important to me that the Little Ice Age and the coarser centuries more or less coincide. Tetuan, I'm sorry, not Tetuan, but Portofarina. Portofarina's star began to decline at the very tail end of the Little Ice Age. That would be sort of late 17th or really 18th, late 18th to early 19th century. But its maritime fortunes as a courser capital began to decline at the end of the Little Ice Age, when the major river system in the central Mediterranean, the Magerda, radically and precipitously shifted its course. Silted up, its port silted up, Portofarina could no longer rival other ports that is, nor engage in courser activity. And so my point is to flag the dearth of environmental histories for North Africa prior to 1830, once again with the exception of McNeil's exceptional work. And this is conjecture on my part that we can make those sorts of connections, but I'm just hoping it's more of a call or a prayer to historians to pay more attention to pre-colonial environmental history for North Africa. Finally, this cameo Maghreb Center Down Under perspective was not intended to refute or repost Eurocentrism, although I think it does raise the questions of where Europe began and ended and who and what was a European. Nor did I intend to engage in Mediterraneanism, but my only purpose, simply stated, was to suggest that we approach the Mediterranean, wherever we may be along those rims, through a double approach, one that is both anthropologie partagée and histoire croisée. Thank you so much.
We have 10 minutes for questions or comments. Yeah, please.
Found it fascinating, the reference to the dissimulation in early modern travel. And I'm just curious, I'm just curious if you can elaborate on the examples you gave about the English in the 16th, 17th century attending Mass. I mean, that would have been absolutely heretical. And then the, cross-dressing as well. I mean, where did you find?
I got that from Alison Games, The Web of Empire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she has those examples there, which I found fascinating.
Okay.
Of actually dressing, eating, and attending Mass which is pretty spectacular.
Okay,
Yeah.
I have to look at that. Okay.
But I think it has to do with the urgency of where they were. If they were in Malta, attending Mass was probably de rigueur because
Yeah.
you couldn't dissimulate the fact that you weren't on Mass
No, okay, no,
on
that's
Sunday
right,
as
that would
easily in
work
Malta
there.
as you might be able to do elsewhere.
Okay, that's true. Thank you.
Judith.
Thank you, and thank you, Julia. I had a question about this fascinating issue of identity fraud, dissimulation, and I wanted to make sure I understood your argument correctly, that it was on the rise during the 19th century because of sort of a crystallization of, if I understood it correctly, crystallization of national identities or new kinds of legal regimes, et cetera. Because I did want to sort of query that, because it seems to me that perhaps one of the big themes of Mediterranean history, if we can speak about such a thing in the early modern period, is the prevalence of identity fraud, right? And identity shifts, I would say, in particular. You know, you think of renegades, you think of converts, you think of reconverts. So, you know, and all kinds of people pretending to be things they are not to gain advantage, be that advantage commercial or simply, you know, saving their lives or whatever. So,
I think
you know, is
that
the
was
argument
part
that
of
it
the paper I
changed
didn't
somehow
get
in the 19th century, or is this more a continuation of certain patterns that were so
Right.
prevalent in this?
That's
in
a great
this
question.
region?
Actually, that was the part of the paper, I didn't time myself well, that I had to leave out. Actually, my argument is exactly that there is a continuation of older practices of dissimulation, identity fraud. But with the rise of the passport and letters of introduction and steamships, and not sailing ships, and passenger lists on those steamships, it's much more difficult then to dissimulate. So that new forms of protection, i.e. the passport or papers of introduction, make it more difficult, in fact, to engage in dissimulation. So that's exactly right.
If
Thank you. Yeah.
I could ask, it seems one of the key components of identity, of course, would be language. And if we're thinking of the Mediterranean or the sea as a homeland, what would the native tongue of that homeland be? And here I think the question of lingua franca is really interesting because it's a masculine tongue, I'm assuming. It's not a mother tongue. No one is born and raised on it, right? And as a negotiation, it seems the matrix of the language is Latinate or Indo-European, whereas the other aspects are Arab and non-Indo-European. So there's already, just as a framework for thinking through identity linguistically, there's some interesting questions about lingua franca. But the question is that, to rephrase Judith's question around language, is that to speak lingua franca is it's as an identity. There's no authenticity. There would be the question of authenticity here would not be relevant or fraud. But the framework of performance would be pertinent, because to enter into whatever that identity of lingua franca might provide for people, it's merely in speaking it.
Although it shifted from port to port. So in Tunis, you had a denser sort of, as one would expect, concentration of Sicilian terms, et cetera. And if you went maybe onto Western Algeria, it'd be more Spanish. So it's not a single, I just want to make sure it's not a single language, as you know.
And it has it's a language without an army.
It's a language, exactly. I think also when people begin needing papers to get on or to travel, then that also has an impact. Because now the papers are written in English or French, whereas before they were often a mélange of, it was actually, some of the letters of introduction are lingua franca written down, mélanges of Arabic, Provençal, Sicilo-Italian, etc. So with the 19th century rise of the expansion of the passport and of traveling papers, that's when a single sort of linguistic identity is imposed or supposed upon individuals in motion or travel. That makes sense. Yeah, that's a good point.
This may be an extension of the previous comment, but I was interested in the use of papers to sort of dissimulate or confirm identity. But I'm also wondering the extent to which the reverse happens, that papers start to play a more instrumental role in creating identities. Mm-hmm. And here I'm thinking perhaps more about a land-based phenomenon in terms of the protection system in pre-colonial Morocco and the way Moroccan protégés can sort of gain various European identities through papers, through their consulates. And I'm wondering to what extent this sort of also bleeds into maritime practices, and what kind of sort of arbitrage starts happening in using those papers to create new forms of identity that link you to European powers.
And I didn't mean to imply that just because you had a piece of paper that lots of forms of dissimulation and identity fraud and theft hadn't gone on. As I don't know if you've seen the recent issue of IJMIS on North African histories, but there's a wonderful piece in their article on how Moroccan Jews went to Algeria and pretended that they had served in the French colonial army, and they got their army papers, and they used the army papers to get Algerian protégé status and what. So, I mean, all of this is going on, you know, whether it's in the form of the written word or not. But you're absolutely right about creating new. That's also another function. That's something else I have to pay attention to. Although the maneuvers sort of behind all those pieces of paper are enormous, and the historian often only has access to some microchip of documentation that suggests all these maneuvers that are going on there.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on. Our next presenter is Professor Nabil Mattar.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Osama and the organizing team for the invitation. Really appreciate that. And where is Elizabeth, who managed to print my paper somewhere? So I thank her. This paper has been long in gestation, and I want to take the opportunity to thank Molly Green, who I pestered at one time to read, and I'm sure she had better things to do, but she read it and provided very helpful feedback. This paper has, I think, cost me a number of friends, so I hope I don't lose you. Let me start with 3 quotations about the sea which the Europeans called the Mediterranean, the in-between sea, Mare Media Mediterranum. The first is from Yaqut al-Hamawi, who died in 1229. In Mu'jam al-Buldan, al-Hamawi referred to Bahr al-Andalus, the Sea of Andalusia, the Sea of Morocco, al-Maghrib, the Sea of Alexandria, the Sea of Sham, Syria, the Sea of Constantinople, the Sea of the French, the Franks, and the Sea of the Rum, the Sea of the Europeans. Although al-Hamawi continued that those seas were one sea, Bahr Wahid, he had no conception that they were a sea in between, Mutawassit. 4 centuries later, in March 1620, members of London's Trinity House informed the Privy Council that they had summoned shipmasters to discuss the name of the sea that they often call, quote unquote, the Levant Sea, and which extends, again quote, from the Strait of Morocco to the coast of Syria, i.e. Skandaroon, Tripoli, etc. End of quote. Evidently, the English, who within a century would rule the waves, did not have a designated name for the sea. 2 months later, they were commanded by the Admiralty to use the name Mediterranean Sea, which begins, again I quote, at the Strait of Gibraltar, or Morocco, and extends to Malaga, Alicante, the Isles of Majorca, Minorca, Zante, Kandy, Cyprus, Skandaroon, Tripoli, and Alexandria. End of quote. Just over 3/4 of a century later, the Moroccan ambassador, Abdallah ibn Aisha, wrote to his French host in Paris, Louis Jourdain, on 1 August 1699, quote, إن النصارى قاطبة البحر لهم كما قيل البحر للروم. To all Christians belongs the sea. As it is said, the sea belongs to the room, to the Europeans. Long before Brodel, the sea was created, given its Mediterranean name by Europeans. And since then, the study of the early modern basin has remained dependent on European sources and European theories. Such study has paid no attention to the fact that over 2/3 of the basin was not European. Actually, at the end of the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II, Brodel admitted that he never consulted sources in Arabic or Ottoman, the languages of the southern, eastern, and half the northern shores of the Mediterranean basin. The recent PhD dissertation of Tariq Kahlawi, however, has gone a long way in filling that lacuna. The title of the thesis, which I think is an excellent piece of work, a depiction of the Mediterranean in Islamic cartography, 11th to 16th century, the surah, the images of the Mediterranean from bureaucrats to the sea captains, which was completed in year 2008. This is a superlative study of the sea in Arabic geographical and cartographic sources. My interest this morning is in the period after Brodel and Kalhawi. Between 1598, Brodel's terminus at Qem, to 1798, the Napoleonic invasion and the year which Albert Hourani views as the beginning of the modernization of the Arab world. My interest is also in the Arabs, or the Arabic-speaking peoples, who inhabited the lands extending from Iskandarun to Tangier, or Bar al-Arab, the Arab mainland, as it was known and distinguished from Bar al-Turk, the Turkish mainland. Although the Ottomans ruled the eastern and southern Mediterranean basin, excepting Morocco, Arabic speakers were the merchants, chroniclers, fishermen, pilgrims, princes, ambassadors, and historians, but not soldiers, who may well have constituted the largest Muslim population sailing the waters between these two parts. These Arabs, I shall argue, had a different view of the sea basin from their European counterparts. In their writings and cartography, there was neither a conceptualization nor a designation of an in-between sea, mutawassit. The word never, ever appears in any text I've looked at, nor as a sea of Brodelian connectivity. Rather, the sea was a multiplicity of seas which exposed them to European piracy and invasion. Perhaps that is why, as far back as al-Hamawi, whom I just mentioned, he had added, after describing the sea as one sea, Bahr Wahid, he had added that it was a hajiz, a barrier between Bilad al-Rum, the lands of the Europeans, and Bilad Masr of Egypt, a defensive space between two lands, religions, and civilizations. Al-Hamawi wrote at a time after Genoese and Venetian ships carrying the Crusaders had come to control the sea, and when Muslim fleets were on the decline, notwithstanding piratical activity. This paper records the subaltern voice about this barrier. In the Atlas of Al-Sharif al-Sifaqi of 1551, there is no name for the sea. It's just drawn, but there's no reference. This namelessness may help explain the disparate names of the sea used in 1590, when Ali ibn Muhammad al-Tamjruti sailed from Tetuan to Istanbul by sea. His account is the only travelogue that has survived in Arabic of such a journey from one end of the sea to the other until the 18th century with al-Miknasi. Al-Tamjruti mentions the Black Sea and the Atlantic, al-Bahr al-Aswad and Bahr al-Muhit, the only sea name that could be associated with the Mediterranean is the Sea of Tangier, Bahr Tanja. He had no conception of a larger or unified basin. Sailing east from Tetuan, Al-Tamjaruti makes numerous references to the dangers of the sea, chiefly captivity by pirates from among the Nasara, the Christians, whose nationalities he did not know. This danger threatened Muslim travelers in the west, Al-Maghrib, which after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 had become dominated by European fleets from Maltese to Venetian, French, and later British. That is why Al-Tamjruti told of a man from Dar'a, from Morocco, who so feared the sea pirates that he decided to migrate inland to a region where its people did not even know what the sea was. He took a ship's oar and went around asking villagers what it was. He settled in Dar'a because the villagers did not know what it was and thought it was the plank which bakers used to scoop bread from the oven. 20 years after Al-Tamjruti barely escaped the Maltese pirates, the Druze prince Fakhreddin
fleeing from Mount Lebanon to Italy in 1613, encountered the same danger as the Moroccan ambassador. With his retinue, the prince rented 3 ships, 1 French and 2 Flemish, nota bene, and then his secretary wrote an account about traveling by sea, which took 53 days from Sidon to Livorno. But at no point did he record the name of the sea, describing instead the encounter with, again, Maltese pirates, Maltese corsair, a word that Arabic adopted as Korsan. In the Maghreb, as in the Mashriq, European Korsan destabilized the sea. For Arab seafarers, the sea was nameless and dangerous. When Yusuf ibn Abd al-Fasi traveled in 1587 on the Atlantic coast of Morocco before launching to his journey to Yemen, he used the coastal road near what he simply called Al-Bahr al-Malih, the salty sea, a name that appears as far back as Ibn al-Athir in the 13th century. He was constantly warned, however, to remain inland, since the Europeans, from the sea came on land to hunt for Muslims. يَتَصَيَّدُونَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. Such association of sea danger with Euro-Christians was a constant in Arabic writings. In 1663, the Moroccan traveler Abu Salim al-Ayyashi mentioned how he and his companions arrived in Damyata on Bahr al-Rum. There, they rented a ship to take them across the lake, Buhaira, but were terrified when they saw some of the Rum, Nasara, on board the ship. As he said, "For our seats were near Christians in the ship, but they did not hurt us, and we parted amicably." Christian Arabic writers, interacting with European missionaries and merchants or reacting to their presence, had access to geographical and historical information perhaps unavailable to their Muslim compatriots. But it did not include the nomenclature about the sea. The Iraqi Catholic priest, Han al-Musali, sailed from Iskandarun to Venice on board an English ship, but made no mention of the sea. Later, when he sailed to the Spanish port of San Sebastian from France, he crossed Al-Bahr al-Gharbi, the Western Sea. And after continuing on land to Barcelona, he found that the city was located on Al-Bahr al-Sharqi, the Eastern Sea. Surprisingly, he did not seem to have picked up the Media Terrarum name of the sea from his European hosts, but used names that had been used in Arabic for centuries. Patriarch Mikhail Brake, writing from Aleppo, mentioned only the Caspian Sea, Bahr Caspian, but then closer to his Syrian home, he described how Kursan al-Bahr, corsairs of the sea, attacked Jaffa and committed many deeds, amilu a'malan, including the seizure of 2 small ships. The identity of the corsairs, the pirates, is identified by the retaliation of the local populace on Deir al-Franch, the monastery of the Franks, which they looted. The sea, in his as well as in his compatriots' imagination, was so associated with danger that the day of judgment, which was to happen in 1783, was to be preceded by turbulent seas. When the 17th century chronicler of the Andalus, Al-Maqarri, who died in 1631, recorded his fear of Maltese pirates as he was crossing from Tetuan to Alexandria, he used the designation Al-Bahr al-Shami, the Syrian Sea. Evidently, a partition of the sea basin was taking place, reflecting the balance of power between the Muslim Ottomans in the east and the Christian Habsburgs in the west. Thus, Al-Bahr al-Shami for the sea in the east, and Al-Bahr al-Rumi, European Sea, for the sea in the west. But the danger continued. In the next century, a chronicle about Egypt mentioned Jarkas Muhammad Beyk, who fled westward from the delta toward the Libyan city of Derna on the coast of Al-Bahr al-Malih, the Salty Sea. There he boarded a Russian ship to Moscow. But even the Russians were beginning to pose danger on the sea. The Tunisian Hamoud ibn Muhammad ibn Abdul Aziz, who died in 1788, wrote of Bahr al-Sham, the sea into which Malik al-Moscow, the king of the Russians, was intruding and seizing Tunisian travelers and pilgrims off British and French ships. In the 19th century Bulaq edition of the Arabian Nights, Al-Bahr al-Malih, the Salty Sea, and the Ajam, the Franks, or the European Christians, are mentioned together in Nights 294 to 269 and 863 to 894, which tell the story of Muslim captivity in Italy. From the sea came the danger of abduction and forcible conversion to Christianity. The image of a terrifying sea or seas dominates Arabic writings, but not because Muslims had a religiously ingrained or instinctive hostility to the sea, as historians from the 1920s to the most recent work by Xavier de Planhol have tried to argue. Danger of captivity was a major factor in the terror of the sea, especially after Europeans, chiefly British and French ships, acquired ascendancy by the introduction of the long-range guns. From the initial attacks on the North African coast by Portuguese pirates and navies in the 15th century, and throughout the 16th, 17th centuries, the Iberians, the French, the British, the Maltese, and Genoese were active in the seizure of men, women, and children for domestic and transatlantic slavery. The result was the growing awareness on the part of the North Africans that much as they wanted to trade and sail and travel, the sea was not theirs. After the attack by Admiral Blake, British, on Tunis in April 1655, the Bey wrote the following, quote, "We have our subsistence from the land without needing aught from the sea. Neither do we expect anything from the sea," end of quote. From 1 to 16 July 1688, the French Navy with its advanced and ship-based guns bombarded the city of Algiers. The superiority of the Franks made their ships untouchable. Algerian guns could not reach them from the shore, and the French fleet simply bombed and bombed until the sailors were exhausted after having used 10,420 bombs, as one English eyewitness reported. The Algerian fleet, which had been the strongest in North Africa, was irreparably damaged. Not surprisingly, the English diplomat, Sir William Temple, who died in 1699, explained how, quote, "For many years they, North Africans, have hardly pretended to any success on that element, on the sea, but commonly say," and he's quoting, "that God has given the earth to the Mussulman and the sea to the Christians," end of quote. In 1699, Moulay Ismail of Morocco wrote to the exiled James II in Paris that had he not been, an Arab, belonging, quote, "to a people who knew nothing of the sea, or had he someone under him who did know something about the sea," end of quote, he would have sent him a fleet to help him in invading Britain and regaining his throne. Although Morocco had a long coastline, and although there was a history of Moroccan commercial and naval activity, both licit and illicit, Ismail no longer viewed his country as a maritime power. 3/4 of a century later, Abu Tayyib al-Qadiri recalled a story about the invasion of Tripoli in 1510 by the Nasara, meaning Spanish. Sometime before that year, a number of Christian ships had docked in Tripoli. He wrote, "A local merchant bought all the cargo on board the ships and paid in cash. Another merchant decided to show hospitality to the Christian merchants, so he invited them to his house and hosted them to a magnificent banquet. Then, to honor them, he took a diamond, crushed it, and sprinkled it on the food. The Christians were stunned. As they started eating, they needed a knife, but the host could not find one in his house, nor in his neighbors, and had to go to the marketplace to buy one. When the Christians returned to their homeland, their king asked them about Tripoli. They answered, 'We have not seen a country with more money and less weapons, whose inhabitants cannot protect their city.' So the king sent a fleet and occupied the city, istawla alayha, in one night." I will jump, because I thought I would have more time. Okay. So, in the light of the above, it becomes necessary to reevaluate the conclusions of historians who have written about the connectivity of the Mediterranean, because their views rely on exclusively European sources. Thus, Horden and Purcell, who, citing not a single Arabic author, proclaim, quote, "The Arab tradition portrayed the sea as poor, alien, and uninviting, but by and large as a unity, as a single sea full of islands whose integrity was animated by its geographers, despite obvious pressure to divide it between Islam and the rest of the world," end of quote. Many others have repeated their views, again without examining a single Arabic source. Meanwhile, Sharon Kinoshita has urged that the study of, quote, "local small-scale interactions and connectivities," end of quote, but these small-scale connectivities between short distances and definite places do not produce a large-scale unity or a conceptualization of the Mediterranean as a contiguous basin of connectivity, at least not for the Arabs. After all, at no time in the early modern period, And from the 17th century on until today, could a Moroccan or an Egyptian cross from Beirut to Tangier or from Istanbul to London in a ship built by his own countrymen and manned by his own co-religionists? And when, as a child, my parents took me from Beirut to Genoa or Venice, we sailed on the Hesperia and the Ausonia, Italian ships, although we once sailed on a Turkish ship. In the early modern period, a Frenchman or a Dutchman or an Englishman could cross from the English Channel or the Atlantic coastline via the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to the Sea of Marmara or to Jaffa or Alexandria on board his own people's ship. While it may have been a humdrum experience to journey from Spain to Egypt, according to Goitein's analysis of the Geniza documents cited by Hodon and Purcell, it no longer was so in the 17th and the 18th centuries. And so what Palmyra Brummett wrote is correct. The Mediterranean was, as she said, a sea that one could sail all the way around, sometimes facing west and sometimes facing east, end of quote. But only a European, British, French, or Dutch could do that, and not the Arab. After the northern invaders consolidated, the term is Brodel's, their grip on the sea, a unified basin became imaginatively, as well as commercially and navigationally, Mediterranean. But only for Europeans, since, as Layla Sabbar has shown in her study of the 17th century, Damascene biographer Muhammad al-Amin al-Muhibbi, and as Muhannad Mubaideen has shown in his study of the 18th century historiographer Muhammad Khalil al-Muradi, the geographical focus of the Arabs in the Levant, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt turned to the Islamic regions of the east, which they could traverse by land, not the Christian regions west of Istanbul. Again, this is not to deny that there were travelers and ambassadors, captives, who moved across the waters from one shore to the other, but to describe, therefore, the early modern Mediterranean as a network of connectivity that tied their continents together, and to proclaim, as Brodel did, a shared Mediterranean political sphere, is to confirm the Mediterranean as an exclusionary European mare nostrum. And if the Mediterranean was a frontier, as Linda Darling has recently argued in an article, it was a frontier that Europeans were ever pushing. It was their frontier, and for better or worse, they broke down the Hajj. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah, Molly.
Thank you, Nabil. I was struck by the stability of the nomenclature in terms of how the sea is referred to, and this that never comes in, and so on and so forth. So this indicates that in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries,
when there is an active nautical presence, right, so that the corsairs are sailing all the way to England, and of course some of the corsairs have come in to North Africa from the Eastern Mediterranean, that there isn't any intellectual exchange between those types and your chroniclers. And I'm guessing it's because they're from completely different social groups, and the vast majority of them are not Arab, but in fact Greeks or renegades.
And in terms of the piracy from North Africa, I mean, obviously it was very extensive piracy, but I mean, navigationally, much of it was being done by converts. And in terms of a ship, let's say the ones that attacked Ireland, attacked Iceland, these were manned by locals, but the captains were Dutch and, and Flemish converts. And so they were the ones who handled and had control over the navigation. But in terms of other resources, I mean, it was limited to the coastal line. I mean, they would sail from one place to another because they could still see the coast. But to cut across, I mean, nearly all the Moroccan travelers I've looked at would, let's say, leave from Tatouan or Tangier, depending on the period of time, and they would go to Tripoli or to Algiers. And they would by far prefer to have a European ship to travel on. All of them who went to Europe insisted on going on European ships because they knew they were better, they were stronger, and they were kind of, they knew where they were going. while, in terms of their own navigations, the pilgrims, etc., again, they begin to rely heavily on that. So by the end of the 17th century, I would say all navigation is now taking place, unless it's kind of small range fishing, but all navigation, pilgrimage navigation. I mean, those who traveled, let's say, from Morocco, from the Maghreb to Alexandria, and then kind of went down all the way to Mecca and Medina. This was going on European ships. So, they lost completely their ability to use the sea at their own terms. I mean, they had to use it as hires.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk. Do you happen to know when the term al-Bahr al-Mutawassit becomes used, and what's the process of using this term? Is it a sheer translation from Mare Nostrum, and when does it become common parlance in the Arab world?
Could I just tag it? When does, and the phrase al-Bahr al-Mutawassit al-Abyad?
I had actually a postscript about that. I thought I'll have time. I didn't. The term Mutawassit, not Abyad, is the Turkish name, the Ottoman name, and that kind of is used infrequently, but it is there, particularly in the 18th century. I've found a number of references in Arabic sources, both Christian and Muslim. So they use that, but it would have been a short paragraph because there aren't that many. By the 19th century, and the first person who kind of uses the term Mutawassit, at least in the modern period, is Tahtawi as he's traveling to France. And then it's a wonderful thing because there are a number of Moroccan travelers, well, Magharibi travelers, I don't want to say only Moroccan, who go to France, to England, and they're all, pretty excited about getting on these steamships, and, they know where they're going, there are no pirates, very, very safe. And one kind of uses the term, now we are on this sea, al-Mutawassit, because it kind of separates us. But Tawassat, he doesn't have a kind of negative connotation as Hajiz, but he says it kind of intermediates between us and the room. I'm sorry? Yeah, no, I mean, that's right. Yeah, I mean, as I say, it was negative. But, and then, the first time you have al-Bahr al-Abyad al-Mutawassit is towards the end of the 19th century. And then it becomes kind of the established term after the end of the First World War, where Europeans are renaming the region and cutting it up, etc. And so what you get is this, what I call the Siamese twin, because it's the two imperialisms of the Ottomans and the Europeans. The Ottomans have their Abyad, and the Europeans have their Mutawassit, Mediterranean. So and they join them together. And so it's al-Bahr al-Abyad al-Mutawassit. Makes no sense at all, but that's what it is. I must admit I haven't. The reason is I've been focused completely on the Mediterranean because of all the discussion that's going on around the Mediterranean. But I really would not know if there was something similar to that. I mean, the advantage of studying the Mediterranean is the huge kind of, the huge atlas that was prepared between the 1930s and 1950s in Egypt by an Egyptian prince. It's 15 volumes. It includes every possible map of the Mediterranean, I guess, that there is. And what he also does is kind of to select passages from travelers, writers, etc., chroniclers, and presents that in terms of information about Egypt, which is also where references to the Mediterranean occur.
he does not include the Maghreb in that, so that's where I felt it was a weak kind of collection. But basically to say, I don't know. I've been looking chiefly and nearly exclusively at the Mediterranean.
For reasons having to do with time, we have space for one last question. I think someone, Judith, you had your hand up. Okay. Yaroslav, please.
I'm Yaroslav Sitkevich.
Sorry, raise your voice, I need to hear you.
Of your university. You mentioned everything marvelously, except one thing that kind of called my attention. The Battle of Lepanto, which out... which, according to Spanish imperial history, of course, is the point where the battle for the control, the dominance of the Mediterranean has been decided, which it has not by the battle itself. Still, the Battle of Lepanto has played this enormous role in deciding which way the final wind will start blowing. And I think you didn't bring up that point.
I mentioned that basically divided the Mediterranean.
Yes, but that there is the Battle of Lepanto specifically, and its many repercussions, and of course in Spanish culture and literary history, Cervantes himself was the victim of it, and then the preceding the Battle of Lepanto, there is Góngora's amarrado al duro banco de una galera turquesca, the Turkish galera turquesca being the kind of controlling factor. Still, after the Battle of Lepanto, that simply disintegrates, or the red line has been drawn, so to speak. The other interesting point is something that anecdotal. The fact that in a very anecdotal, folkloric practically way, you brought in the case of somebody who was withdrawing into the mountains where no one would have ever known anything about the sea or the existence of the sea. This is so anecdotal that it really begs for judgment as being anecdotal, because we have that same factor in the same story, the same anecdote in the Odyssey. Right.
Great. So let's let Professor Mattar respond, and we have to keep moving on.
Unfortunately, I kind of skip pages, but I do come back to that. I'm not saying that there is no interaction across the Mediterranean. I give that as an example. That's an Odyssey example that appears in Morocco. But the whole point is that, in a sense, the kind of control becomes navigation control. It is really the control of the Europeans. And that kind of the sole population from Scandinavia to Nigeria becomes highly marginalized and more kind of problematical, completely dependent on European shipping for trade, for pilgrimage, for travel, for any kind of exchange. You can't have to rely on British, French, cheap, and then earlier Dutch, etc. And so that's the point, is that they lose control completely. But you're right, it's from the Odyssey. It's an amazing story. When I read it, I just kind of stunned me. Where is this coming from? How does it get? No, you're right. You're right. Absolutely.
Our last speaker of this panel is Professor Rochelle Davis.
Good morning, and I'm an anthropologist among a sea of historians, and I don't think that's what the organizers had in mind when they called the at the Mediterranean Reimagined. I hope I'm not the reimagined part, but I thank them anyway for including me in this day, this symposium. I'm going to try and show how I fit into the historians by showing a map of the Mediterranean, just so that we can kind of anchor ourselves. And I'm going to be talking about the Eastern Mediterranean. So two fundamental systems of ordering and categorizing people came into being in the 20th century in the Eastern Mediterranean, systems that define the lives of people today. The first is the rise of new states predicated on the creation of rigid borders, but within them contested definitions of who constitutes the members of the nation within the state. And the second is the rise of what has come to be called the international refugee regime. My paper will examine, in the cursory manner that 20 minutes allows for, some of the trends in refugee movements and resettlements that have taken place as a result of the wars and state formations of the last 100 years, trends that have shaped and continue to shape the Eastern Mediterranean and the populations and states that exist there. And I'm going to leave a lot of things out, so please forgive me for that. As an anthropologist, my focus is on the present, and my previous research and publications examined refugees from Palestine, Iraq, and now, unfortunately, Syria. The framing of this conference around the Mediterranean has inspired me to consider more deeply the historical events that connect people's lives through multiple generations. And it being in honor of Faruk Tabak has also pushed me to think about the ecological, environmental, and economic dimension of the subject of refugees, which I won't be able to talk about today, but which I'm going to try and fit into the larger project as I continue to carry out research on the subject this summer. I was also pushed to think about the deeper historical connections by a brief and understandably angry conversation I engaged in last year with a Syrian refugee in Turkey. And we talked in the old city of Mardin, which is on the southeastern border of Turkey in the heartland of the Syriac and Arabic-speaking communities in Turkey. And this man's family is Syriac. I'm sorry I'm saying it that way, but it's too close to Syrian. In Arabic and in Syriac, Syriani. And they belong to the Syriac Orthodox branch of Christianity, which traces its community back to Antioch in the time of St. Peter. And he said to me, quote, "My family left Mardin 100 years ago to escape the massacres." And I have gone back to try and understand all that he was talking about, and these were the massacres that he was referring to of the Syriac community, were part of the genocides perpetrated under the Ottoman and Young Turk regimes in the late 19th and earliest 20th century that killed or drove out most of the Armenians from Anatolia. Lesser known is that the Syriac community was also targeted and killed or forcibly exiled. This Syriacs family had fled 100 years ago from Mardin, and they had taken refuge in Hasaka in present-day Syria. You can't read the words on the map, but the two circles, the northern one is Mardin and the southern one is Hasaka. Now, he said, we are fleeing again, this time from Hasaka back to Mardin. And the angry part of the conversation was directed at me for suggesting that the revolution would bring a much-needed change to Syria and more freedom for Syrians. He neither agreed, nor did he think much of the revolutionaries who had robbed the families leaving Hasaka on the road out of town. The stability of life in Syria, a life with his family, where he had a home and a passport, was understandably more important to him than the hoped-for ideals of a better life that the revolution hopes to bring. My point in this presentation is, as I focus on the Syrian refugees and as they flood into the surrounding countries, is that understanding how they are being dealt with by the various state and international bodies and comparing that to the past allows us in some ways to understand better the contemporary power of states and the meanings of citizenship, state sovereignty, notions of belonging, and the regulation of space. My point, I hope, that I can sort of make clear is that the current state system was created in the Eastern Mediterranean in great part on ethno or ethno-religious bases, but that was also predicated on foreign intervention and refugee movements out of some countries and into others. In the process, these two sort of the creation of the states and the refugee movements make natural the absence of former residents and the acceptance of new ones. And they have created international regimes that hold a particular group in limbo within the state system. And in this world today, citizenship has become a privilege. I'm going to list in a terrible fashion the kind of the various population movements and wars and et cetera that have taken place that sort of characterize the Eastern Mediterranean. And then I'll go back and detail a few of them as part of the rest of the paper. As I mentioned, the Armenians and Syrianis, the Syriacs in the late 19th and early 20th century, with the founding of the Republic of Turkey and the end of the Ottoman Empire, you had the Greeks leaving Anatolia and the Turks coming from elsewhere into Anatolia. In the 1920s and 1930s, Jews fleeing Nazi Europe found refuge primarily in Palestine, but elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. In 1948, Palestinians were forced out of Palestine in great numbers and took refuge in the surrounding countries. And Jews fled Arab countries and elsewhere in post-1948 in retaliations against them that took place. And then particularly in Egypt, but elsewhere in the post-nationalization periods, Greeks and Italians left to Greek and Italy primarily. And Iraqi refugees have been fleeing the regime of Saddam Hussein, but after the US invasion in 2003, primarily post-2005, Iraqi refugees in the hundreds of thousands took refuge in Jordan and Syria. And in many ways, what I'll be talking about is predicated on that, but I won't talk about them since they're not really in the Mediterranean. And then today we have Syrians. So I want to talk briefly about what happened after the Armenians and Syrianis were forced out, were massacred or forced out of the at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and the regimes. What ended up happening was groups of survivors either fled or were forcibly marched out of Anatolia into the deserts to the south, and they eventually began to find refuge in what soon became the countries of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And of course, as World War I is going on, and as the League of Nations and Sykes-Picot is dividing up the region and states are being formed, there is another wave in the 1920s who are victims of targeted attacks. So estimates vary, but if we say around this time there were 150,000 of them in Syria and at least another 50,000 in Lebanon and Palestine. They added to well-established and older Armenian and Syriani communities, and they put great strains on the people in the places where they took refuge. For the most part, they were hosted and protected by locals, and they held out for hope to return to their lands and homes. That never happened. The short-lived Armenian Republic was taken over by the USSR in 1920, and the French supported the idea of an Armenian state in Cilicia in southeast Anatolia, but that was then incorporated into the Republic of Turkey and emptied of its Armenians with the signing of the Lausanne Agreements in 1923. According to those agreements, quote, Armenian refugees were granted Syrian citizenship and acknowledged as one of the official sects among 14 different sects in September 1924. While many Armenians settled in the urban centers, primarily in Aleppo and Beirut, and the French Mandate authorities in Syria also established Armenian villages for the refugees along the Syrian-Turkish borders in the area of El Jazira, which served to settle the area and build up commerce. And there's been a great deal written about that, which I don't have time to talk about. But it sort of reconfigures commerce in the area in interesting ways. Their protection by and then sort of co-optation and at some points by the French Mandate authorities created suspicion among the Arab and Syrian nationalists struggling for independence from the French Mandate regime, and newspapers at the time deal a great deal with this. But to return back to the refugees, what ended up happening was that their claims to their lands, lives, and properties were ignored. The incredible destruction and massacres were unacknowledged. while they continued to work actively to maintain memories of this past and to commemorate the genocide, they were given citizenship elsewhere and were expected to adapt. In this sense, at the outset of the creation of states and of the state system in the Eastern Mediterranean, the individual and the individual's way of relating and communal rights of relating to land and property and space and place was sacrificed to ensure the creation of the states, both by the states and by the international systems that negotiated on behalf of the states. I'm now going to jump 20 years forward to 1948. So during and after 1948 and the war that took place that started between 47 and 49, another huge wave of refugees was created. At this time, at least 750,000 Palestinians, who made up half of the 1.5 million Palestinians who had been living in Palestine, and they were made homeless and stateless with the creation of Israel. They found refuge in the surrounding countries of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, as well as within the borders of Israel. The overall response in each of these countries was much the same as it was to the Armenians and the Syriacs, and as it has been to the more recent Iraqi and Syrian refugees, one of general understanding, of the provision of assistance, and a distance from sort of the calculations of all that is going on politically. The UN had full support in creating resolutions that called for the refugees' return to their homes, Resolution 194. And the UN created the now defunct United Nations Conciliation Commission, the UNCC, to carry out the functions detailed in Resolution 194. In 1949, it then created the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, to address the refugees' humanitarian needs. And these things are important because the UNCC no longer exists, but UNRWA, of course, does. And as we all know, United Nations Resolution 194 was never implemented. But UNRWA carries on registering refugees and providing education and health care to those registered in its systems. Here, in this situation, the rise of a new state built on an exclusivist, sort of ethno-religious system goes hand in hand with the creation of a regime of refugee management. While like the Armenian and Syrians, 25 years prior, Palestinians have had no access to their former lands or property, received no compensation for it. They were placed within a system for managing them as stateless persons. Unlike the Armenians and Syrians, they were placed within a system managing them as stateless persons. In the Palestinian case, neither the host countries nor the refugees agreed to tawtin, or any sort of resettlement, although there's an exception to those living in Jordan because of the unique situation that developed there. And those people have Jordanian passports. Most Palestinian refugees carry laissez-passer travel documents provided by the host state and not provided by the UN bodies. Now I'm going to jump another 40 years, 45 years, to Syrian refugees today. Those red circles are where refugees are located and the size of them. There are over 1 million Syrian refugees today registered or awaiting registration in the surrounding countries. There are probably many more who are not in those categories. Israel is the only border country not allowing refugees in. Thus, in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq, refugees are allowed in and they can access aid. In Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, refugees constitute a reasonable percentage of the population. In Turkey and in Lebanon and in Jordan, they are each over almost 300,000 people today. They do, however, strain resources such as water, physical locations in which for the refugees to live, other infrastructures, and the goodwill of the population. Building on their experience from dealing with Iraqi refugees, the UN has stepped up and is coordinating coordinating the aid aid provision with the states, each state's government, as well as national and international bodies. The exception to this is Turkey, which took on sole responsibility for Syrian refugees within its border. However, it adheres to the geographical limitations in the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, and thus grants refugee status and rights of asylum only to those coming from Europe. And it has a very strange definition of Europe, which includes Azerbaijan. Officially, though, the Syrians are recognized as guests. However, according to UNHCR, Turkey has declared a temporary protection regime for Syrians, the core elements which include an open-door policy with admissions to the territory for those seeking protection, protection against forcible returns, and access to basic registration arrangement where immediate needs are addressed. In addition, the Turkish Prime Ministry's Disaster and Emergency Management Directorate, as well as the Turkish Red Crescent, have provided tents or containers as living spaces, food and other facilities, and sometimes even cash assistance. It should be noted that all of these states have really stepped in to aid those in need. However, in this regime of states and refugee regimes, in Turkey, Syrians with passports can enter and travel freely in the country, and they can exit at will as well, honoring agreements made between Syria and Turkey in 2009 for visa-free travel. People without passports, however, cannot, and they are confined to the refugee camps, which are closed. They are closed to both people, so people cannot leave them, and they are closed to people, others cannot come in who are not refugees or with the refugee management services. So, in a sense, the way that Turkey is dealing with these, both with the Syrian refugees, keeps the kind of state system and sort of the ideas of citizenship as part of how it deals with people, privileging those with passports and with the ability to have done that. Among Syrians, the non-citizen refugees create a different issue, and by non-citizen refugees I mean the Palestinians living in Syria who perhaps carry travel documents, and they number about 500,000 people. They have been allowed almost all of the sort of rights of Syrians, including to live and work there, unlike the Palestinians in Lebanon, but they've never been granted Syrian citizenship. They too have not been spared the wrath and bombs of the regime, and Daraa and Ladiya and Homs and Yarmouk camps, among others, are shells of their former self, with their populations scattered throughout Syria and beyond. Jordan has forbidden Palestinians from Syria to come into Jordan, as it did with Palestinians from Iraq, an act of fear, I imagine, due to the large makeup of its own country's citizens who are of Palestinian origin. But because all of these countries are letting Syrians in without documents, Palestinians are fleeing to Jordan. Palestinians who are fleeing to Jordan say they have to hide or discard the material that documents them as Palestinian to then enter as sort of documentless Syrians. The irony is that as a stateless people, they have such little to document who they are that they essentially carry papers of statelessness, and yet they are fleeing their homes once again, and they can only be treated as stateless when they hide those papers that indicate their very statelessness. The Armenian refugees seem to have found a place of refuge in Armenia, which is working to get them out, and how they are getting there is not yet clear, but they are a whole other component of this. In conclusion, the 20th century creation of states in the Eastern Mediterranean presaged the creation of refugee populations named as such, and has had a hand in the development of the international regimes to manage refugees. As we move into the 21st century, the existence of massive numbers of refugees continues to challenge the coexistence of the state system and the UN refugee regimes. And by massive numbers, we're talking the latest UNHCR statistics cite 33.9 million people of concern to it, 14.7 million internally displaced people, and 10.5 million refugees. However, UNHCR does not consider Palestinians within its mandate, and so Palestinian numbers are not counted there. This issue of the challenge to the coexistence of the state system and the refugee regime is in part because in the mid to late 20th century, states began to treat citizenship, as I said, as a privilege rather than a solution, as it did with the Armenian and Syrian refugees prior. And of note is that in 1996, some 17 years ago, UNHCR coined a new policy related to urban refugees that recognized that providing aid and protection via refugee camps did not reflect the reality of where Palestinians were living. And in 2009, they created a new guidance on the subject. In the new policy, this space that they created to think about refugees was now considered a protection space, no longer a physical one, as in the camp, but one that includes refugees wherever they are, and that ignores the administrative and legal statutes of the country. Martin and Taylor write, quote, "When refugees take up residence in an urban area, whether or not this is approved by the authorities, UNHCR's primary objective will be to preserve and expand the amount of protection space available to them and to the humanitarian organizations that are providing such refugees with access to protection solutions and assistance," end quote. I would like to argue that this shift to a protection space potentially reformulates to the larger concept of citizenship, citizens' rights, and state borders that has developed in the 20th and 21st centuries. And I think that sort of the notion of sort of sovereignty and the implementation of sort of state control over its territory is challenged by this, because what is happening is that as we move into this way of thinking of citizens versus non-citizens who can coexist together in the same state, just that the non-citizens as refugees have a protection space, it prioritizes the violence of the state that produces the refugees. Because if the refugees now have a normalized and protected space in which they can live within another state, there is then little incentive or pressure to work for or to allow for them to return to their homes or to grant them citizenship in their countries of residence. Instead, if the movement of Iraqis and Syrians in the 21st century remain models for this new UNHCR idea of a protection space, then what we are witnessing today is a system in which a large population is protected but without rights, alive but unable to make a living. In other words, a new regime that oversees a permanent and legalized limbo of stateless populations within states. Thank you.
We have some time, please. And there are microphones in both aisles. I haven't said that yet. Please make use of them.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the refugees you spoke with refer to the Palestinian case as a kind of paradigm. Is that a reference point? Because that seems to be the kind of the meta narrative of limbo, and UNRWA is this kind of ongoing thing. So I'm wondering if the Syrians you spoke with. And I don't know if you're talking also to Armenians, how they conceive of that. Is it an imaginary at all? Do they create these links? Thanks.
I think everyone who has lived with Palestinians has sort of that notion in mind of what has happened to Palestinians over time. But I don't think most people know the kind of legalistic and details of it, and so I think that part is not relevant to them. I have not spoken to any Armenians, so I can't answer. I have spoken to a lot of Palestinians living in Syria, and in that regard, it's been, I've heard a number of different reactions, and I think their being Palestinian really informs how they think about where they're going to go and how they're going to take refuge. And also their sentiments of belonging and sort of love, for lack of a better word, of the camps where they have lived for now almost, for most people, most of their lives. So I had Palestinians say to me, I'm not going to leave the refugee camp in Syria to go live in a tent in Jordan. I mean, that seemed to be a pretty common sentiment, and so they found other places to try and live within Syria. Alternatively, I had a friend who told me about his grandfather who was a refugee from Palestine. He's in his 80s, and he said he will not leave the camp except to go back to Palestine. And he's in Yarmouk camp, which has been under heavy bombardment since December, and he continues to live there. And so I think there's a lot of, for the Palestinians themselves, there's a lot of, I mean, the attacks on the camps have raised a lot of kind of deep sort of searching and a lot of emotions about thinking about who they are and where they can go and what that will mean to them as individuals and as a collective.
Thanks very much, Professor Davis. Very interesting talk. In starting to try to think through the causality of this shift in state responses to masses of displaced people, one thing that struck me during your talk was the possibility of thinking about the duration of the displacement and thus how the time that states have to think about these issues and frame them and then respond to them. You know, it seems to me, I know much less about the Armenian and Syriac examples, but these took place over a much longer period of time. So, if that has played into the state responses, thank you.
Yes, I think is the answer. But it's a great question, Jeff. I think one would have to really sit down and kind of go through in a very systematic way and look at some of these things and try and sort of calculate them. But from what I know from how Jordan and Syria responded to the Iraqi refugee flood, which really started in, I mean, there was many before, but came in great numbers in 2005, it took them a year or two to really kind of formulate policies that it felt comfortable with as a state, and then in negotiations with, in Jordan's case, in negotiations with UNHCR and the US government, which provided much of the funding for dealing with the Iraqi refugees, they reformulate, they continue to reformulate policies. And so I think that always keeping in mind that it isn't just going to be one thing, but that it's going to constantly move and change and is something that's useful to keep in mind analytically. For a refugee living on the ground in that situation, however, it's incredibly confusing. And I know Iraqis in Jordan they just could never remember, they never knew exactly where they were supposed to go for health care at a particular time, or what documents they needed to register their children to go to school, or if they did, and what they were going to be told, and just sort of the constant shifting of state policies or UN policies or whoever creates a lot of anxiety in a situation that's obviously anxiety prone.
I think it might be, and thank you for this really fascinating talk.
It was very interesting how you sort of surveyed the whole 20th century. And I think it might be interesting just to think about, when is a refugee not a refugee? And I was thinking about the big exception to this picture you paint are the Turkish refugees, coming into Turkey as the Ottoman Empire collapsed in Europe. And I've been very struck in my time in Turkey how they do not see themselves as refugees. And in fact, there's none of the, it's not at all like the situation in Greece where there's the you know, the longing for the place that they came from and all that. I have many friends whose parents or grandparents are from the Balkans, and it was just sort of an incidental comment, like someone has red hair. And it seems to be a very, very, you know, none of this sort of the Greek thing, remembering Anatolia. And, you know, it seems to have a lot to do with they arrived at a moment of national triumph. They were told it was a moment of national triumph, and this message seemed to really stick.
Yeah, I think that's an astute analysis. I mean, I would agree. I think that's similar. I think in some ways it's similar to also the Jewish communities who were forced out of, who fled from the Arab countries and North Africa, et cetera, and came into Israel, but that it was presented to them as a triumphalist, you know, ingathering of Jews, et cetera. And so they don't, I mean, that's why I didn't say Jewish refugees, because they don't even necessarily think of themselves as refugees. And yet clearly, you know, they were displaced and they had to leave behind land and property and all of those sorts of things. So they fit the kind of larger definition, but also don't necessarily, I mean, some do, of course, but many don't. So it's a, yeah, it's a great question.
If I could, Rochelle, you mentioned that you work in the present, and it seems to me that just that, and that the problems you're looking at having to do with people and lived lives and what it means to be situated and what it means to be moved, and how that relates to the nation state, that begs a question, at least in my mind, about, maybe it's for the historians to think about Mediterranean studies, which is in the discipline of history. Obviously, arguments about the past are also engagements with the present. And it seems to me, to some extent, the arguments about the things we've been talking about on this panel, movement, obviously, what it means, you know, to travel or to be expelled or to raid, and these sorts of stories, versus what it means to be situated, either in the sense of the geography or terrain, or in terms of rights that accrue to placement and life in a place. In literary studies, which is where I come from, the Mediterranean as a trope is directly linked with, it's almost always about the past, an imagined past, usually nostalgic mode. And it is usually tied to a project of multiculturalism in the present. And this is, so you could go around the Mediterranean, Ibrahim Abdul Magid or Edward Kharat in Egypt, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra in Palestine, Stratus Terkas in Greece, Jean-Claude Itzot in Marseille in France, Amara Lachous in Italy, Juan Goytisolo in Spain, and I suspect we could spin off a lot, but they are reimaginations of the past, and the Mediterranean as a trope of the reimaginations of the past always against the sorts of identities provided by the nation state. And I'm wondering to what extent that's, well, it may not be interesting, but it seems to me, in the literary sense at least, that the past as a trope for thinking through the present is very explicit. I don't think historians necessarily would wear it on their sleeves all the time. Some might, but I'm wondering to what extent the past and present are, arguments about the past are really working out issues in the present as you think about it.
The classic statement of that comes not from a historian, but from a novelist, William Faulkner. The past is not dead, it's not even past.
Thank you, Elliott. That's it.
Is that it?
That's it?
Oh.
My grandmother told me that. So she was right.
You know, one big query or question I have, and a lot of us have, and historians, by the way, do very much, they're very much aware, and they have been for, I don't know, the last half century at least, if you read History and Theory Journal about the problem, actually the problem of the present always sort of impeding in our interpretation of the past. But one thing that bothers me, and I don't have any answers to it, is when did people in the Mediterranean start thinking about themselves as Mediterranean? It's quite recent, actually. I think 19th century French Algeria, there was certainly a movement by the Codelon, by the Europeans, to claim a Mediterranean identity against a French identity and against the Muslims and Arabs. But I mean, I've also found some Mediterranean movement in the interwar period among literati from Tunisia to Egypt, where they assume the guise of Mediterranean in order to counter both imperialism and nationalism. So it's against those two twin forces. And then I found one other curious example of Mediterraneanism as a proclaimed and self-conscious identity, and that is in the 1932 Congrès des Femmes Méditerranéennes. So there's this international congress of Mediterranean women, which takes place counterintuitively in Constantine, which of course is inland. But I don't know much about it, but that's the first time I've even seen a statement about women thinking of themselves, women from Turkey attended, from Syria, from all around the basin. First time I've seen sort of a concrete example of a collective and concrete example of a group of people actually assuming that kind of identity. So I'm hoping that other people can help me out here. So we need to, I mean, this is a big project to try and find out how are we going to do it. When did people start thinking of themselves as Mediterranean in a more or less favorable fashion? Although there are lots of unfavorable attributions attached to being a Mediterranean, as we know from anthropologists starting in the interwar period.
I can't answer the question that Julia just posed, but
William Faulkner.
I can point to other examples of nostalgia for former transnational identities. There's a Habsburg nostalgia in Central Europe, for example, perhaps based more on wishful thinking than accurate understanding of the past, but nostalgia for a time when people of different language, different religion could interact, rub shoulders harmoniously without the inconveniences of modern nationality, passport and other encumbrances. I suspect it's more wishful thinking than it is anything else, but the decay of imperial regimes in the late 20th century has perhaps created a situation in which fondness for an imagined past, multicultural, harmonious, can flourish in literature and in the imagination.
Elliott, thank you for that, because I think it's thinking about the past and the present is really useful, and the way you framed it is really interesting. And building off what John was saying, there's been this whole sort of movement and discussion in Turkey to think about the new Ottomans and neo-Ottomans and all of that is not just a political sort of charge leveled at Erdogan, but that is also kind of culturally, people are pulling back that. There's these TV shows that are, go into the Ottomans, both documentaries and fantastical sort of fictional stories. But yeah, it's where, and in literature as well, and this imagined past is much allows and expands and opens to that kind of multiculturalism.
Can I just comment on that with, again, Turkey? There's also this nostalgia about the
Ottoman past, and Jenny White has written about this, and nostalgia for one's lost Greek and Armenian neighbors. But it's kind of a nostalgia for multiculturalism because they don't like the current multiculturalism that they have. Again, I couldn't agree with you more that this is always tied to a current project, and it's specifically directed against what they see as the degradation of Istanbul with the influx of all of these terrible people from the East. These Kurds and sort of half Arabs. So this is often what it's tied to.
Can I just quickly make a point about innocence and lack of innocence? the Ben Ali regime, to a great extent, but also Bourguiba, promoted Tunisia's Mediterranean identity, but it was done so in order not to talk about Islam or Arabs or Muslims on the southern shore, on Europe's southern shore. So that's another dimension of. Oh, okay, Bill, I don't want to poach on your. All right, sorry.
All right, I'd like to invite us all to continue the conversation over coffee and bagels and whatnot, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes' time.